Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a really great week, and I hope you enjoyed our discussion board and some of our assignments. So, what we're going to do today is that we're going to talk a little bit about your discussion boards, and we'll go through them and kind of dissect them a little bit. I do apologize that this particular podcast is not going to have my face; it will just have the audio and the screen of it. Having a little bit of a technical difficulties, but hopefully by next week that should be resolved. So let's go with our discussion board. So what we have here is that we have a individual, and this individual's name was John Moore, and he was getting a standardized treatment for leukemia. So the pretty much chemotherapy, um, radiation, all of the full 9 yards. The disease did not reoccur. Researchers kept the spleen cells alive in nutrient media, and from looking at those cells, and this is something that they routinely do, that they can keep some of your tissue, and they can do a little research on it, especially if it is a university hospital, as we have here at SLU, and we have at WashU, we have teaching or university hospital. And what they found is that his blood had a protein that showed a lot of promise as a treatment for cancer and AIDS. So as a result, the researchers patented the cells, and when Moore found out about this, he sued because he wanted some share in the profits. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Moore, saying that this lawsuit threatened to destroy the economic incentive to conduct important medical research. That's basically that if you're going to have to pay patients for things, or there is an incentive um, to pay patients to harvest some of their cellular material to conduct cancer research, then it really just compromised the ethics and the integrity of important medical research. And it may also be a roadblock to keeping people, keeping researchers from being able to access this type of information. Moore argued that the ruling left patients vulnerable to exploitation at the hands of the state. Do you think it was treated fairly? So, there's a couple of times that I do this in semester where I'm going to ask you to, sorry about that, I'm going to ask you to base a position that you might not necessarily agree with based on your age. And that's just because I want you to start kind of thinking critically and thinking on both sides of the argument. So even if you are not necessarily for or against John Moore, you will have an opportunity to see what the other side of this discussion is like. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into these discussion boards. So Jason Martin says that if it were just a spleen, and his group is he is the against, Mr. John Moore, if it were just his spleen, doctors may research from his blood and bone marrow as well, and would not remove from the safety of the patient and the success of the surgery. So from what Jason is saying here, basically he's saying that those cells didn't directly have anything to do with what he was having treatment for. Um, and so the patient was safe, and there wasn't any compromise to the patient's safety as a result of the surgery. And it was still successful. He was still clear of cancer, so he doesn't see why he should be given any um, monetary compensation, considering that he got what he came there for, and that was to be cancer free. That was really interesting. Angela Paula, and I apologize if Andrea, if I mispronounce your last name. Many people don't read all the fine print when they're signing their documents, and that's absolutely true. So they will suffer the consequences of not paying attention to the detail. And you're absolutely right that a lot of that documentation that you sign, and especially if you're going for something really stressful like cancer treatment, a lot of time patients, and I know I'm guilty of this myself, we just sign away, just make me better. So he may have been in that category as well. So this is an individual that is for John Moore, but can clearly see the other side of this argument, so that's really good. And so further down, she writes that I think there should be a special consent drafted that will incorporate and cover all aspects of the human body. I don't think there should be any compensation for the donor. It should be voluntary donation for the benefit of science and medicine. And there are a lot of people that feel the same way that we have here. So she's got some other threads that read about responding to other discussion boards. So, Alexandria Taru, responding to Kisa, I found that he did not give consent for his organs to be used in medical research prior to his surgery, but they also found no proof that the doctor intended to use his cells until after the surgery was completed. When they found out that he had something unique about them, he was sent a letter of consent to sign once the patent for the medicine went through, and he initially signed it. It wasn't until he took it to a lawyer and found out there were profits being made that he became interested. So that is a very good point, Alexandria. Thank you very much for writing that really well thought out discussion board. You are absolutely right that um, there were consent papers that were sent to Mr. John Moore, and he initially agreed to allow them to be used. I know for myself, with my last pregnancy, um, I had genetic testing done at SLU, and they asked if it was okay if they used some information from my genetic testing. And of course, immediately I wanted to know exactly what information they were using. So in my genetic test, I had a blood test to look for chromosomal abnormalities for this is for my latest pregnancy. And fortunately, everything came back as it should be. But there were questions and there were boxes that I could check or not check on how much of my information or how much of my cells I wanted them to keep. So, being that I am a scientist, I of course consented to them using any information they found in my cells or in my fetal cells. Actually, it was amniocentesis, but the blood protein from my fetus because it's very interesting. They can tell a lot about your growing fetus through just a blood test. If it's late enough in pregnancy, I think about 14 weeks. So I told them that I did totally consented to that. So if there was something really interesting about my blood proteins and they could find be useful, then in research, then no, I would not be compensated for that because that information I have already consented on. So here we have Megan, and she is in the four. She looked at the case, and the information was submitted and taken a couple of things into consideration, especially since I am for John Moore. Considering the whole reason he had his spleen removed in the first place because he had leukemia, I'm taking the stress of cancer into consideration when he made the point to sue once he found out the research could possibly pose some scientific benefits. I see him as looking at the whole situation of having cancer and trying to find a positive out of it, and at the same time getting some type of compensation. The other thing that a lot of people won't take into consideration are the effects of the surgery is depression. Oh, very good point. That can follow after a major surgery. Major depression after major surgery is a very common side effect, and for a man to not only have to deal with cancer but major surgery to have his organs removed, John probably suffered from a deep amount of depression as well. I feel like if I was in the situation, I would always want some type of silver lining out of it. I also want to address another reason John is suing, and that's because if the research shows that his cells are producing the possibility of a cure, what would stop them from doing further testing and avoiding him from further research? I think John does have the right to sue due to it being his genetic material and also because it would have gotten cancer. He wouldn't have gotten cancer in the first place would there have been no grounds for research. And you have some really good points there that initially when he signed the paperwork, perhaps as you said before, that he was not thinking clearly. He was not himself. He was depressed and maybe he just wanted to see something positive come out of it and not really reading the fine print, as we said up here earlier. Who was that talking about reading the fine print? I feel like that was Andrea. Talked about reading the fine print. So I think that is an absolutely beautiful consideration to make. I think that's really cool how you've taken that into consideration. What was he dealing with at that time? And also, the question is also out there. If he never had cancer, with this information, this research would not be out there. So perhaps being that he has a host of medical bills, that maybe compensation is in order. So really, really good. And then we have Amy. Um, let's see, I'm going to read Amy so we can find her. Okay. These are great questions, Pams. When taking a look at the case, that automatically having to be against or for John Moore, I believe that without his consent, he would have a fighting chance against the courts. And absolutely right. The fact that he did sign his consent, that kind of legally ties you into the situation. Um, Elizabeth Peterson says, I believe the hospital should have to inform patients the possibility of donating their organs, tissues, and blood and what they can result in. After the patient is informed, they may choose which parts they like to consent to. Not many people have the understanding and may be naive or deceived into the results and being taken advantage of. It's not ethical of the hospital to take advantage of its own patients. And that's absolutely right. It's not ethical. And places like SLU, like where I had my genetic testing done for my pregnancy, they were very knowledgeable and they were very straightforward with the questioning of whether or not I wanted any of it. It was just blood they were taking from me. Any of that blood to be used for scientific research, and also making it very clear that any research developments that resulted from that would not result in any type of monetary compensation to me. So some hospitals do a better job of explaining these things than other hospitals will. So, Marianne, my position is against John Moore based on three main reasons. First of all, Moore's spleen and therefore his cells were not patented by him before the procedure. That is very interesting because they weren't patented by him, and there is a patent law that says it's first to file. So even though you may have had this really great idea or he's had these really interesting cells, long before anyone knew, however John Moore is 30 years old, I'm going to guess he's had these cells for 30 years. He did not file a patent for them, and it's first to file. So that's a very good point. I see a little bit of an attorney coming out in this one. Although it's not common practice for one to patent his cells, people do not do so automatically and give up their rights or any relation to them, according to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Therefore, Moore lost any of his rights that once the cells were removed for him. It also brings up the second reason, which is that patients do not have the right to access organs once they are removed. That is also very true. According to the American Medical Association, this is something that is stated in the doctrine of the informed consent, which is issued to patients before such procedures are done. The APA states that physicians are required to disclose personal and economic interests that may influence their judgment, which means that Moore was previously informed of such possibilities. Finally, the doctor's duty to the patient and at the point of treatment. Therefore, the doctors did not have any obligation towards Moore to inform him of any matters or provide him with financial compensation, and Moore legally had no rights to display themselves in the first place, according to U.S. regulations mentioned above. So those are all very, very good points that you have there, Marianne, and absolutely with the first to file for the U.S. Patent and Trade Office, that's absolutely the way that it works there. So then we have Emily. My stance is against Moore, and my findings I discovered that the state of California has a statute that was already in effect and handled issues on the rights of cells and organs after they are removed. It basically protects the government, researchers, and doctors, and anyone who is trying to help the betterment of mankind by finding potential cures. The way I think of it, that if someone used my organ for research and that research was able to help suffering people, I would not need to own anything or have rights to anything because I did not do anything to really deserve it, if that makes sense. If even the fact that they removed my organs to save my life, in Moore's case due to his illness, I definitely would not try to get financial gain or own property of my exudant remains. I would just be happy that I'm alive and pray that others are helped too. So you're very altruistic, and a lot of people feel the same way as well. And that's kind of the way researchers look at it. They're not seeing those cells as an individual person. They're not seeing them as, those are Emily's cells. They're seeing them as cells, and they're seeing them as something. What can they learn about this cell, this kind of miniature microscopic machine, this miniature small unit of life? What can I learn from this? So they're absolutely, so when they're looking for treatments and cures, they are not necessarily looking at the individual they came from. And we have bioethics committees that they kind of look at the bigger picture of it, whereas researchers and doctors typically aren't looking at that aspect of it when they're looking to do biomedical research. So then we have Pam. Keisa, I'm leaning towards the court's decision also. If Mr. Moore was asked to sign a consent to carry out research on blood sample, maybe the consent should have included verbiage stating that he would be that he would or would not be compensated for any outcome of the research. I keep coming back to this because it seems to be changing up his intentions. If I give you my car, sign the title over, and 10 years later you found out there's a part in the car worth millions of dollars, should I be entitled to a portion of the sale? There's blood in the spleen, which is a part of the deal that he consented to. So that's a very good point too. And that kind of goes back to what other students have said, that perhaps the language should be really laid out very straightforward as to what would be happening, whether you would or wouldn't get compensation for, and can we even use these cells for research, which it's been my experience that more and more hospitals are, especially for cancer research or removing organs, they will want you to sign something asking you that. Now, some hospitals do it better than others, like SLU. They do a very good job of laying out exactly what you are doing, what you're signing away, whereas some places don't do as well. So Matthew here says, I agree with your statement, Laura. The hospital did their civic duty removing the liver. However, I do not agree with your statement. Removing the liver for its benefit without any presumption that the resulting surgery would benefit in the long run. Of course, the hospital has a hope of developing something from remains in a surgery like that. Leftovers are sent for research, and in all reality, hospitals are a business, and their team of lawyers drafted the waiver to prevent patients from winning a lawsuit in cases like Mr. Moore's. The hospital almost takes advantage of patients in their time of need in a scenario like this. So, and there is that as well. Like I said, there are some hospitals that do a better job at spelling things out for their patients and what their tissue, because at the end of the day, it is still Mr. Moore's tissue, right? It's still his tissue, even though it's no longer in his body. It's still his tissue, still his blood. So some hospitals do a better job than others in spelling things out for their patients. So, let's go down here to, I think I was reading some of the replies too. So we'll read this one. All right, so Pam, for her jury post on here, going to give this one a read. I have to admit that when I first read the discussion question, my first thought was whether or not there was patient consent. Then medical ethics and morality kicked in. Being a medical professional, I totally understand both views. Research is so important for the development of medical advancement that would ultimately improve the quality of life and cure diseases. But researchers and medical staff have to also involve the patient in those decisions. Absolutely right. Beautiful. Questions for the foregroup. Since bioengineering is becoming the norm today, do you think there should be a special consent drafted, maybe similar to an organ donor process, that will incorporate and cover all aspects of the human body? Should there be some set percentage that a donor will get when cells or tissues are used for compensated research studies? For questions for the against group. Hypothetical questions related to property and ownership. If a person lived in a house for all their lives, owned the property, later found out there were specific organisms on his or her property that would totally eradicate cancer, HIV, and AIDS, would they let the government or researchers claim ownership of this organism without permission for the sake of ethics and morality? So those are some really good questions on there, both for the for group and the against group on there, where it's really kind of looking at how could the whole, asking for the for group, how could the whole benefit from this information, and for the against group, looking at this question of ownership, really looking at this question of ownership. So let's go down here to this one from Laura. From the ethical stance, I do not believe John Moore should have received money for the removal of his spleen. Without the removal, his cancer would have continued to spread, which would have ultimately been fatal. The hospital did their civic duty in removing the liver for his benefit without any presumption that the resulting surgery would benefit them in the long run. Moore then filed a lawsuit after learning of the patent Mo invented by the scientists would not have happened without his spleen. If John Moore had learned that the patent was invented specifically from the blood cells taken from his spleen, he would have never have sued the university for shared profits. And that's absolutely right. You're kind of looking at what is this individual's motivation for doing this. So these have all been some really fantastic discussion boards here. And we're going to read this last one here that we have with Emily. I will share 3 facts as to why Moore did not have the law on his side according to resources found. Moore doesn't have the law on his side because he retained no ownership interest, which we've already discussed. Second, the state which Moore resided already had a law in place that limits patients' control over excised cells. The statutory law already protects doctors, physicians, and surgeons from issues of liability and ownership once the medical field begins their research. Third reason is that the patented cell line is factually and legally distinct from the cells taken from Moore's body. To me, this means that once the researchers, physicians, doctors, surgeons, and the like began the research, other cell components and genetic material was combined to create their own cell line that was no longer identical or resembled the initial cells taken from Mr. Moore's body. They did do some tweaking, and when I say tweaking, they would remove that protein. So they would take that protein, that component, and they would try to make copies of it, and they would also try to use biotechnology to to alter the cell somewhat. And when I say alter the cell, they would take that gene out and they would try to put it in another cell, that gene that makes that protein from the DNA, and put it in another similar cell that wasn't Mr. Moore's cell. They took that gene and they put that in another cell to try to get that cell to make that protein. So we have that. So with those 3 points, it's very surprising to me because at first I really wondered how Moore would have not have won the case that his cells are technically his body and property. But the more I read, I finally understood the scientific and legal understanding of why Moore could not win. His cells are his property, especially after the 3 points were previously stated. If Moore had taken interest in his cells before the surgery took place, I wonder if he would have any success due to California's statute law that is already in place. Also, a very interesting case. This case is a lot like, I don't know if anyone of you ever heard of Henrietta Lacks. So Henrietta, I'm not spelling very much, well. So Henrietta Lacks was an African American woman who is the progenitor of the HeLa cells. And there's a beautiful book that's written called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And it talks about, and I'm just going to click here and show this book here. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This is in the 1950s, and her cells were actually used for cancer research. In fact, every graduate student, for the most part, since the 1960s or 70s, has probably worked with HeLa genes because they were cancer genes in her body that were able to just constantly make new generations. Now, although she's been dead for many, many, many years, she has her cells continue to live. They just put it on nutrient agar, and she continues to have this lineages of cells. And her family didn't know about this. And when her cells are so important that we not only use them for research for graduate students, but they were vital in developing the polio vaccine, understanding cloning the way that we understand cloning, gene mapping, knowing where specific genes are on the chromosomes. They have been bought and sold tons of different times, and lots of money was being made off of her cells, but her family couldn't even afford health insurance. So this book is a story about that, about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks and how her cells were being used. And at this time, there was no paperwork that she could have signed that says, hey, I don't care if you use my cells and I give you consent for this. They never requested consent from her family. And her family was asking for compensation. And I know for many years, her family was not able to receive compensation for the billions of dollars that were made from her cells. Although there was a lot of money made from those cells, there were also a lot of really important medical discoveries and findings that were made from them as well. So I would implore you to possibly read this book and it just gives you a really interesting position of what we just talked about in the discussion board. All right, so that is all we have for this week, and we will bring it back next week when we talk about your discussion boards again. Have a fantastic day.